Hello! Today we are doing a video that has been 10 years in the making because I have officially been keeping my super nerdy, very anal retentive spreadsheets about reading for 10 years now. So I am now officially able to do a little, color commentary on how my reading has changed over the last 10 years, how the shape of my collection and kind of what kinds of books I have, how many books I have has changed over the last 10 years. And I think this should just be I'm actually when I started putting some of the numbers together, I did find some really interesting things and sort of insights into like the bookish landscape in general, as well as my specific kind of life circumstances and reading tastes. So we will get into that. So I want to start with the collection piece of this. I have basically two main spreadsheets that I have going at any given time. One I call my TBR list, but really it's like my collection spreadsheet. And the other is my specific reading spreadsheet for a given year. So we're gonna start with the collection one. And these numbers are a little shakier because I started pretty small and started scaling up over the years. So I would have to go back in the initial years and sort of retroactively figure out what the collection numbers were. Basically, I just wasn't doing a very clean job of sort of like closing out a previous year's collection spreadsheet and opening up a new year's collection spreadsheet very efficiently. So just a caveat here that I know that some of these early numbers are a little like not as firm, but I think that they are directionally or like materially correct in my old like audit class parlance from when I was getting my accounting degree. So it was actually really, really interesting to see how my collection has changed over time. One of the most interesting pieces, I think for sure, is volume and format of my book collection. So when I started keeping these in 2011, we were still sort of at the beginning of the ebook revolution. So in 2011, I had 4 ebooks in my entire collection. And in 2020, I had 2,033. So huge increase there. And that just reflects the fact, well, a couple of things. One, just the fact that adoption of ebooks, I think, really exploded in the 2010s and became much more common. But the other thing is my reading preferences, which is going to be a recurring theme here, changed so much in the 10 years. And my primary preferred version to have a book, if it is what I would consider to be sort of like mass market type fiction, so a lot of the romance I read, for example, is to have that as an ebook. I also read a lot more independently published authors now than I used to. A lot of times it's easiest and most cost effective to get those as ebooks as well. So other thing, well, I guess we can get into volume here. So print-wise, I went from having 385 print books in 2011 to having 952 books in print in 2020. So if you couldn't tell, my overall collection grew from 389 books to 2,904 books over those 10 years. And this gets into both that format thing I was just talking about, reading preference, and also just like life circumstances and the fact that this closed out with me in my early 30s, living in my own home in a city that I plan on staying in for the indefinite future versus in my early 20s, being in my first job, living in a house I shared with other people, and knowing that I was going to be moving a lot likely in the coming years. So let's break that down. In terms of reading preference wise, I definitely went from being a very heavy nonfiction and literary fiction reader in my early 20s with a lot of mystery thrown in there as well, to being pretty much an omnivore by the time I got to my early 30s. So I definitely read some fantasy every once in a while. I went on like a kick of that when I was first in college. Some sci-fi thrown in there, but a lot of what I read were just sort of like general fiction. And then especially because at the time I was still kind of like a practicing evangelical, a lot of my reading was nonfiction of some kind of theology. So that just lent itself, all of those books I just mentioned, the format that I would like to read those books in is as a physical book for the most part, though I have definitely shifted more towards audio for nonfiction since then. And in the intervening years, I ended up writing my master's thesis about the romance genre and really like fell headfirst into it. And coming out of grad school, I really just could not do kind of like heavier general fiction anymore. Like I have just in the last couple of years finally kind of really gotten my groove back with that. So I was reading a lot of genre fiction, and a lot of that is available as ebooks at very low prices. I also made the mistake, and I know a lot of people make this mistake when they first start getting into genres where ebooks frequently go on sale. So a ton of my collection I got for 0 to 99 cents. And I just like any book that sounded remotely good to me at the beginning, when I was still like really learning my tropes tropes in romance, I would just go ahead and pick it up because I was also on a very limited budget when I was in grad school, obviously. So I was reading a lot from the library, and then pretty much any ebook I was buying was free or very, very inexpensive. So I just got a lot of books that were of kind of middling quality during that time period. So anyway, all that to say, I think that just in terms of the volume piece of things and the format of everything are very tied into just kind of the change in genre I experience, as well as just my change in life circumstances. And actually, I guess we can maybe go ahead and talk about some of the cost associated with this in terms of life circumstance. So I went back and forth about if I wanted to include this because frankly, like, I know I'm opening myself up to some judgment here, but I decided I thought that this is an interesting point of just sort of like transparency and kind of comparing what the different cost of things are. So in 2011, the total amount that I had spent on books at that time was $3,118.45. That was what I had spent on the 389 books that I owned. The average cost of those books at that time was $10.43. So fast forward, I now have, goodness, let's call that like 7 times as many books. And the total value of my collection of what I have spent on books now is $10,716.57. Seeing it laid out like that, I don't know, it is a little just like, man, that's a lot of money. But the average cost of book for me now is $6.64, which reflects exactly what I was talking about, this period of time where I really discovered ebooks, and ebooks now just comprise, I think, 69% of my collection. So much of that, so many of the books that kind of beefed up the volume, I was getting inexpensively. And what I have in turn done is focused on when I buy something in print, I tend to want to buy it in a hardback form that I can hold on to. So just to give people a sense of like, I know I get a lot of comments on like my beautiful books and I really enjoy them. I see that number and I'm like, yeah, you know, if I spend $1,000 a year on books, that seems about right to me. And actually it's less than that really, because in the 10 years I've increased the value by 7,000, but let's just call it, let's say I spend $1,000 a year on books. That seems about right to me. I enjoy my books. It is my main hobby, as you guys can tell. So anyway, I just thought that that might be kind of an interesting data point in terms of the really nice books I have. I'm really thankful to have. They're not necessarily cheap, but I kind of offset a lot of that cost by getting books for free through the library, getting free ebooks, and then also now I do have publishers sending me a good amount of ARCs for free as well. So we did talk a little bit already about the shift in genre, but looking at these stats in my collection in terms of what I own, it is interesting to me to see that in 2011, I owned 0 contemporary romances, and that today, that is the biggest owned category I have, and I own 849 of them. Again, so many of these I got for free, and I think I went a little ham, and I think it was like 2014 or 15. It was a lot, but that is a very clear difference. My second biggest owned category, I believe, is mystery and horror, which makes sense. I am a big mystery reader, and a lot of the mystery books that I want to read, I actually struggle to find for free, so I end up having to buy more of them. Speculative romance, I believe, is the third one, which makes sense because I would say if I was gonna tell you the kind of romance I like the best, it is probably speculative. It's harder to get the ones I like for free. That's why I don't have as many of them, but that also makes sense to me. And then the other big ones are historical romance, that makes sense. Classics is a big one for me. Again, that makes sense. General nonfiction, fantasy. Those seem to be kind of like my biggest owned categories in my collection. In terms of where I get books from, again, I think this is so interesting to look at because in 2011, the biggest single source of books for me was Borders because I used to work at Borders. I had an employee discount. They also sent out these very dangerous 20 and 30% off coupons all the time. And I was not an ebook reader really at that point. So pretty much my entire collection was in print. So it makes sense that most of those came from a physical bookstore, and that bookstore was Borders. Now, far and away, my biggest place I have books from is Amazon, which again, that makes sense given that I am such a big ebook owner now, and I kind of got in early with a Kindle, which is part of why I just don't know that I'll ever move away from it because that's just sort of what I'm used to, and that's where the bulk of my collection is at this point. And it's also interesting to me that now, just because of BookTube, my second biggest owned category of like where I've gotten books from is publishers because I've gotten a lot of e-ARCs over the years, and then also also, I think the third biggest one is Book Depository, which makes sense because I have a lot of these kind of special editions that I enjoy getting from the UK or just a little harder to get my hands on, and Book Depository is the main place I go to do that. So I think that also is very indicative of the change of my overall reading taste and kind of like how I read over the years. What else did I want to point out? Oh, I did want to point out that in 2011, 60% of the books that I owned were from men, and now in 2020, that's only 22%. Again, beating kind of like a little bit repetitious here. Maybe I can start not repeating this as much, but once I started reading a lot of romance, I stopped reading nearly as many books by men. Well, actually, it's twofold. One, I started reading romance, and two, I stopped reading like as much religious nonfiction. And those two changes equaled me not reading nearly as much from men anymore. So that was a big change in terms of books I own. You can also see that there's a real shift towards the front list in terms of what I own. Again, I think some of this is that for roughly 40% of this time of statistics keeping, I was doing booktube, so therefore I was more interested in front list things, just that's kind of the nature of being an online bookish person. So you can also see a big skewing towards more recently published books than what I used to own. Two other things I wanted to mention. One is that you can see over time that the percent of books that I have not read really has gone down in my overall collection. So I believe that in 2011, 47% of the books I had read that I owned. So more than half of the books I hadn't read. They were on my TBR. Whereas in 2020, I believe that is now 57% of what I own I have read. And that is because I have kind of changed my strategy in terms of what I keep or what I hold on to, where most of what I hold on to, I want to be books that like I really like and I'm going to reread. And I tend to be pretty good about like, if it's not a favorite, like I'll keep it moving out the door. And then last, I just wanted to mention that the overall average rating in my collection has really gone down. So it used to be my average rating was 3.9 and now it's 3.17. And that is because I have a ton of ebooks that I have DNF'd. Basically is what that boils down to. Because I got so many of them for cheap or for free, I didn't have as much of an investment in finishing them if I wasn't enjoying them. So the rating really went down a full star. And then the median rating went from 4 stars to 3.5. So those are the overall collection stats I thought were interesting over the last 10 years. And I'll try to elide the patterns that I see in my actual reading year over year a little bit from what we've already discussed. But if we look at the number of books I've read, that has greatly increased over time. Is that from 2011, I read 50 books a year. And then my peak in 2015, I read 400 something books that year. And actually my second biggest reading year was in 2020, where I read 345 books that year. So as you can see, I have definitely increased my reading speed a lot. And you can see that huge bump between 2013 and 2014. That was in grad school, like in the middle, like when I was in the thick of things and really having to get through a lot more books a lot more quickly. So you can really see the big bump. And that was also when I was doing my research on the romance genre. So I was having to read a lot of those books really, really quickly. You can also definitely see this increase in the total number of pages read. I went from 15,841 pages read in 2011. At the highest page count actually was in 2020. I read 93,146 pages. Interestingly, the year that I read the most number of books was not my highest page count. Actually, it was my 4th highest page count over those 10 years. And that's because, like I said, I was reading a lot of kind of lighter genre fiction that wasn't necessarily that long. So I actually didn't realize that 2020 was my biggest page count. Maybe I'll crack 100,000 this year. We'll see. I think it's also notable, like I've been saying, to see sort of the trend of the length of books I was reading. So in 2011, the average page length was 316 pages, whereas in 2020, the average page length was 269 pages. Broken drum, but moving towards more incorporation of genre fiction equals more shorter books kind of in the mix. Also, my kitty is upset. I don't know if you can hear her. She has woken up and she would like some attention. Actually, the lowest average page count was in that infamous year of 400 books, where the average page length was 217 pages. So as you can see, just because you read a huge number of books doesn't mean that they're all super long. So this is part of why when people ask about like, oh, what's your goal in terms of number of books? It doesn't really feel that meaningful to me anymore, because it's like, well, am I reading a lot of like novellas? Am I reading big chunky fantasy? Not like it's all just so subjective. So anyway, you can really see that kind of change in my reading habits in the numbers. Again, the male, female / neither. Another interesting data point I thought was the percent of audiobook reading that I did over the years. So you can basically see that in grad school, my audiobook reading went from, like 4 to 14% of my reading to pretty much none. And that was because so many of the books I was needing to read were not available as audio. Like it just wasn't, it was not available, or it was not cost effective if I needed to get the book. I thought that was interesting to see that went way down. And then when I came back to the States and was out of grad school, it started going back up again. And now solidly, I would say audiobooks to some degree, at least I've listened to, maybe I didn't do the whole book as audio, but at least some of it is between like 15 and 20-ish% of my reading now. I also want to mention, just in terms of like grad school really increased my reading speed, I do think it's interesting. When I look back, I think of 2016 and 2017 as very slumpy reading years where I wasn't reading very much, or like not really enjoying what I was reading. Part of why I started BookTube in 2017 was to help myself like re-engage with reading to some degree, like, or more passionately. But if you actually look at numbers, I was reading more in 2016 and 17 than I read before I went to grad school, but I just didn't feel like, I guess just my expectation of the number of books I was getting through had changed really radically. So I just thought that was interesting, that if you had asked me before I went to grad school, when I was reading like 50 books a year, I would have told you like, yeah, like I'm reading a lot, like I'm getting through stuff. But that was, all of this is relative, is what I'm trying to get at. Is it's all about what is a lot of books for any one person is just really different depending on any number of things in your life and your reading speed, all that other stuff. I won't say too much about genre because I think I've covered a lot of that already, but just again reiterating, I do think it's interesting that you can really see the shift in kind of what I was interested in reading over time. And you can see that coming out of grad school, I just think I had a lot more variety in my reading preferences. Again, getting into the differences in reading preferences, and like, I'm gonna acknowledge that this is a little bit of a loaded statement, but I do feel like I have the numbers to back it up. I do want to say that when I was reading purely like kind of literary fiction and nonfiction, as well as theological works, the degree to which I was reading from people who were not like me was almost zero. The only year where that bumped up a little bit was actually because I had two professors actually, who really were involved in trying to promote theologians from the global south, as well as African American theologians. And you can see that one year I had those two professors, my percent not like me went from like nothing to about 12%. And then coming out of grad school, when my reading tastes and kind of like beliefs changed a lot, that was the first year that I hit, I guess, 22% of my reading that year was from people who were not like me, which was also when I started reading more genre fiction, where it was easier to find a lot of interesting books coming from perspectives that were not like mine. So I just want to put that out there, that I think that is an interesting change. And you can see slowly over time, once I really started measuring it in 2017, I became more aware of it and started setting goals. And you can see that from when I set that goal, it steadily went up over time. So this year, the goal is 50%. I hit 41% last year. So we're trending positively in that respect. Yeah. And then I think in terms of format, very similar to what we talked about with my collection, you can really see over time the composition of ebooks, either that I own or that I've gotten from the library or Kindle Unlimited, has really increased dramatically over time. So I also should mention that when you're looking at this, I consider audio as a part of ebooks and counting that, because I have all of them digitally and not as like a CD or whatever. I don't even think I have something to play a CD on at this point. But anyway, you can see the big shift towards e-reading over time. Similarly, you can really see in over time when I did and didn't rely very heavily on my library. So you can see that when I was in grad school and had basically a book budget beyond what I needed for school of like $10 a month, I was relying very heavily on my library in those years. So you can see that really peaked at one point. And I still obviously read from the library, especially audiobooks, but that is something I'm trying to, I think you guys will see or have seen something having to do with the library. I'm trying to be a little bit more purposeful about using that as a resource as well. Similar conversation about years published. Really, in 2011, the average age of book that I was reading was 28 years versus in 2020, the average age of book I read was 7 years old. So over time, because I read so much more genre fiction, that tends to be a little bit more of a frontless situation for me. The age of book has really gone down. The oldest average was in 2012, which makes sense because I was actually reading a lot of like primary source text from like, I don't know, the 400s. So that really my kind of average age down. But anyway, anyway, so I just think that's also an interesting trend over time. You can see that the books I was reading have gotten more and more frontlist. I still read more backlist than I read frontlist, but even the backlist titles I'm reading are a little newer than I think I used to. And then it is interesting just to see percent paid for over time. So in 2011, you can really see that pretty much all the books I was reading were books that I had bought. In grad school, that went down tremendously and then has slowly gone back up over time in terms of books that I've had to pay for to read. Okay, and then two more things I wanted to cover. One is what I call density distribution. So this is how many books I'm reading in a given month year over year. And it's interesting. I've noticed some trends, like I often read less in February. Some of that obviously is that February has a fewer number of days, but also that was when I tended to be moving several times during the last 10 years. Like February just has been a big moving month for me for whatever reason. So that has impacted it. I also keep track of what month when I hit like a new high or low in my reading. And in the two biggest reading years in 2015 and in 2020, those were the ones where I have most of my kind of like month all-time highs. So anyway, I just think I always enjoy whenever I hit a new high or low. That's always notable in my spreadsheet. And then last but not least, the average rating over time. So some of this is that I think as I've progressed in my reading, I have gotten a lot better at picking books that I am confident I'm going to like, but I've also gotten pickier about ratings I give. So it's interesting because in 2011, my average rating was 3.4, and then the lowest average rating I had was 2.8, and that was in 2014. And since then, it's been steadily creeping back up for the most part. I do think that the older I get, I do have more of a tendency to give 3 and 3.5. I think it is harder for me to give a 4-star. I also read a lot more than I used to, so I'm more willing to read a 3-star book than I think I was when I was reading more like a book a week. Now that I read closer to a book a day, I'm more willing to pick up something that I may not love, but just kind of hits the spot for me in terms of my mood. Also, as over time, I've watched less and less TV and movies, and books have sort of become my go-to for entertainment. The way that some people, I think, will watch a few episodes of Law & Order and just be happy because they were fine. That's kind of I'm more likely to pick up a book that I can read in 4 hours in an evening and just be like, yeah, that was fine, whatever, it was good. It kept me entertained for this evening. So I just think over time, I'm both more willing to pick up things that I might not like as much, but also I think I do have a better sense of what books I'm going to like versus which ones are going to be more meh. So anyway, all that to say, I'm actually close to being back to my average sort of like pre-bunch of genre fiction reading, but I think it's because I have those kind of dual forces duking it out in terms of how my ratings get influenced. So yeah, I think that is my 10 years of reading stats that I thought were notable or interesting. I'm sure that this was not a video for everyone, but this is something I enjoy reflecting on. I have had actually a lot of people asking me and like saying like, hey, you said you were gonna do this. So I'm glad you guys were, some of you guys at least were interested in this. And I'm also, when I'm not trying to ascribe like over importance to my reading, but I do think it's good to have things like this out there for future internet historians, because I do think that this tells an interesting picture, if nothing else, about the history of sort of like digital book reading and the early adoption by power readers of that new technology. So anyway, little geeky side note there for future researchers if you are happening upon this video in the future. So yeah, anyway, that will do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know any thoughts you have about this video in the comments below. And I think that will do it for me for now. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, along with my affiliated link to glassesusa.com. So you guys should definitely check that out if you're interested. And yeah, that will do it for me for now. I hope you're having an absolutely lovely day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye.